Hi guys, it's Lizzie from the Academy team and welcome back to part 2 of our Photography Basics series. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Aperture, what it is, what it does, and how you control it. Let's just jump back to part 1 where we took a look at how a camera works and the journey light takes through a lens. So once that light makes its way into the lens, it travels through the aperture. So essentially the aperture is just a hole in the lens and you can control how big or small you make that hole. Let's take a closer look now. Here it is. As we peer down into the lens, we can see it opening and closing. Now normally, if your camera is in automatic mode, the camera decides on how open or closed the aperture is going to be. Cameras are pretty clever and the size of that hole will depend on how much light the camera actually sees. Now speaking of light, just like any amount of material, light has a measurement attributed to it, and in the world of photography, we know it as stops of light. Here you can see one full stop, and the incremental measurement between the full stops are measured in fractions, and in most cases, thirds of stops. Now in the case of apertures, it's the hole opening size that's measured in those stops, and specifically f-stops. As you can see here, f1.4 to f2 is one whole stop of light. And in between, there are 1/3 stop increments. In this case, we've got f1.6 and f1.8. You may have noticed that there's something quite counterintuitive about this aperture scale. The larger hole has a small f number, and the smaller hole has a bigger f number. Now don't worry too much, this confuses everybody to begin with. It's just a matter of practice to get your head around things. Just remembering that a smaller f number means a bigger hole, so more light is coming through the lens, and a big f number means a smaller hole, so less light is coming through the lens. So you'd think that the aperture, which controls how much light is coming into your camera, is all about getting the right exposure, so essentially how bright or dark your image looks. But in fact, photographers actually use it for something a little bit different. This is called depth of field, and it's essentially how much of your image is in focus. Let's take a look at some pictures of these Legos. In the first image, I've focused on the first Lego, right at the front. My aperture, or the hole size, has been set to f4, so a nice large hole. Notice that as we go past that Lego at the front, not much else is sharp or in focus. By using that larger aperture opening, or that smaller f number of f4, I've achieved something called a shallow depth of field. Now it's worth pointing out that if I change where my camera initially focuses from the first Lego at the front to the one right at the back of the shot, we now have the back Lego sharp and in focus and a blurry one at the front. This isn't about foreground and background though. So if I focused on the middle Lego dude, both front and back are now out of focus. So the question is, how do I get more of my subjects in focus? Well, if I control my aperture and move it to f22, a bigger f number, which means we have a really small hole, watch what happens. Now we have a deeper depth of field, i.e. lots more in focus. So by now you're probably starting to realise that photographers actually need to control their depth of field to achieve either less or extra depth of field or focus, depending on the type of photographer that they are. Portrait photographers, for example, like blurry backgrounds or shallow depth of field shots, so the foreground really pops off the picture. Landscape photographers like the opposite most of the time, with sharp foregrounds and sharp backgrounds, giving them beautiful images that have focus from start to finish. Okay, so the next question is, how do I change my aperture? Well, for this, we want to pop our cameras into Aperture Priority mode, and that is found on your top camera control dial, which will look very similar to this. Move the dial to A for most cameras or AV if you're using Canon. AV just stands for aperture value. Next, you're going to want to find your selector wheel. This is usually located where your thumb or forefinger sits. Simply roll it and look out for the aperture changing on the back of your camera screen. This now means that you're in control of your aperture and it's your priority, hence the mode being called Aperture Priority. Now everything else on the camera is looked after for you and it's actually compensating to ensure you achieve a reasonable exposure, but we'll touch more on that later. It's challenge time for me now, so I'm going to go and find myself a subject to photograph so that I can practice changing my aperture. What I want to do is get 2 photos, one with a shallow depth of field, so a nice low f number. For that, I'm probably going to use around f4, and then the same photo but with a deep depth of field. So all I'm going to do is change my f number to something a lot higher. So I'm going to say f22. Now, if you want to have a go as well, then grab your camera and find yourself a subject. Let's see how I get on. So that brings us to the end of part 2 of our Photography Basics series. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll be talking all about shutter and shutter priority mode. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give us a like. Don't forget to hit subscribe and smash that bell icon so you can stay up to date on all of our latest content. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you on the next one.